patience as we deal with our little technical glitches. My name is Althea Gonzalez, and I'm the Program Manager for North Carolina for Hispanics in Philanthropy, and we're thrilled to have you all with us. A few logistics for our webinar today. You are all muted at the moment, and you will be muted for the course of this webinar. We ask that you submit your questions to the host in the chat box. We'll have a question and answer session after both presenters share their information with us, and we'll be addressing all your questions. If at any time you lose communication, you can't hear, you can select Communicate at the top bar on your screen, and then go to Teleconference to get the call-in information again. Or you can select Audio Broadcast to have the audio come through your computer speakers. You can also select Full Screen View on the bottom left to get a bigger picture, and then you can always return to this view as well. It looks like both of our presenters are now here and ready to go. Let me welcome you again to this particular version of HIP's Philanthropy Lab. HIP's Philanthropy Lab are learning initiatives that provide us up-to-the-minute information on issues that are affecting Latinos in the United States and in Latin America, and really is an opportunity for our funding partners and members to take this information and have it impact their work. Today's presentation is going to be specifically around the Latino population in North Carolina. North Carolina has definitely been a front runner in growth in the South for the last 20 years, and HIP's North Carolina Funders Collaborative has been working to strengthen Latino communities since 2002. This last census again showed us that the Hispanic population in the state has doubled, and we're wanting to find out what's behind the numbers, give us an idea of what the trends are for Latinos in North Carolina, which hopefully will inform all of the funders, both within the collaborative and other funders in North Carolina, as to how they can best make an impact in this population using this information. So we have two fabulous presenters today to help us learn more about the trends. The first is Leo Estrada. He's the Associate Professor of Urban Planning for the Luskin School of Public Affairs at UCLA. As you can see in his bio there, he's had extensive experience in working on ethnic and racial demographic trends for Latino population, and specifically in the southwestern part of the United States, but also has helped HIP look at Latino issues across the country, and has served, as you'll see, on numerous advisory boards nationally working on urban planning issues and Latino demographic trends. So we look forward to having him start us off with our conversation. And following him is Deborah Santiago, who's the Vice President of Excelencia in Education and co-founder of that organization. And Excelencia has been working for quite a while to work on improving educational opportunities for Latinos, particularly around college completion issues. And a delightful presenter. She's been in lots of different arenas and serves on numerous boards, as you'll see there. And Deborah and Excelencia in Education is also working specifically with the Lumina Foundation on their Latino college completion. So we are proud to have her as well joining us. So I will now turn it over to Leo to get us started on this presentation. Leo, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you very much, Althea.
Thank you for being here.
Yes. It's early in the morning here, so I can't say good morning, good afternoon. I'll just say good day to everyone, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak for a few minutes. I want to thank Hispanics in Philanthropy and the North Carolina Collaborative for this opportunity. I'm a demographer by training, and my job is to do many things, but I've specialized in looking at racial ethnic trends in the United States. So as you might guess, I've been looking at North Carolina over the past 20 years quite closely. It's hard to sometimes explain what Latino growth is about, so the first slide that I have for you tries to give you a different way, instead of a chart, to think about what's happened and how rapidly it's happened. So I simply list some of the presidents of the United States and link it to benchmarks, demographic benchmarks for Latinos, to show you how rapidly the population went from 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, 20, 30, 40, and most recently 50 million. And it's just pretty clear by looking at even this chart that the rapid growth is quite dramatic and accelerating. And therefore, you should not be surprised that as we look at the United States and where it's going to go into the future, that almost everyone sees that the population is going to continue to grow proportionately. I just have the chart here in proportions, going from its current 15% to somewhere over 30% into the far future. African Americans will not grow as rapidly because they have less immigration, and they're also an older population. But Latinos are expected to be the reason for growth. And throughout the United States, we have regions of high growth and regions of low to no growth. And almost always the main factor that determines whether a region is high growth or low growth is whether or not it has a minority, people of color living there, particularly Latinos, Asians, and then African Americans. The next chart I have is just an illustration that the growth has accelerated such that if we simply asked which is the largest ethnic racial group in each state, then all of those that you see listed in the brownish color represent all the states in which Latinos are the largest ethnic group. They may be small in size, their proportions may not be high, but irregardless, they represent the largest ethnic racial group in any of those places. As you can see, there's a part of the United States in which they are not, including North Carolina. But there's another chart which tells us that the story may be changing, and that's the areas of new growth. And if you remember the chart, the map just before it, you'll recognize that almost all the areas that were not areas of high Latino majority are in fact the areas of new growth. And so clearly something is going on, and it's a combination of economics, that is where jobs are available. It's a combination of networks, that is where family is to be found, and most importantly perhaps, it's a combination of people looking and seeking out new opportunities. So as we move forward a little bit, we'll see something that's quite remarkable, that it really illustrates how this is. And the most important number are the first two numbers in green, under the green columns. The Western United States is considered to be, one of the high concentrated areas of Latinos in the United States. And the Western region, according to the census, includes everything but Texas. And so it would be New Mexico, Colorado, moving north all the way into California. And the total number of Latinos during the last decade, that the growth in Latinos was 6 million Latinos in all of those states, which we consider the traditional kind of areas of Latino concentration. The southern states, which also includes Texas and goes down to Florida and all of the South, had the same amount of growth. So this is a really good illustration of the degree to which growth is equalizing across the United States, and the South is now currently accounting for a large proportion of all the growth of Latinos throughout the U.S. It surprises some people because the general consent, the way in which people think, is that the growth is still in the big states of Texas and New York and California. But in fact, the growth of Latinos throughout the United States has shifted to the extent that the South now accounts for as much growth as does the Western region. North Carolina has been on the radar for demographers for some time. I first saw it in the CPS of about 1992, when all of a sudden the population that was picked up by the CPS in North Carolina was about 300,000 or 400,000 higher than it should have been, according to the previous CPS. And so I saw the report, and I also saw a note that the census was looking into that. Around 1996, they came out with a small study indicating that they did not find an error in the sampling or anything else, and it appeared that something was going on in North Carolina. In the year 2000, it had the highest amount of growth of all the states in the South. It went even higher in the 2010 in terms of the population, but its growth actually declined somewhat. So its growth is now about equal to most other states. Mississippi looks a little odd because it's the highest, but Mississippi has a very small population, less than 30,000 Latinos. And so the growth went from 30,000 upward and to 700,000, and it looks pretty impressive. But growth rates are now pretty stable around in terms of all the populations. But North Carolina, which is the top line, continues to sort of be at the top, and is clearly the one that we're all looking at. The next one we're looking at, of course, is Maryland, that's there, and then South Carolina, which are the three areas that all of us who are looking at Latino growth in the United States kind of focus upon. The growth of Latinos is really quite fascinating in terms of the way it's been changing. The growth caught everyone off guard in the year 2000, but it was concentrated. And when we went back to look, we saw that some of it was where we expected to be, like around Charlotte, Greensboro, but also kind of surprisingly up in the Cumberland area and Winston-Salem. Those are kind of like the key places that people recognize as being there. And then by the next decade, we saw what we've seen in so many other places, and that is the growth in one particular area spills over into adjoining counties as the population grows and it seeks housing, and it can't find it any longer in the traditional areas. And so this spillover into adjoining areas has now created an entire region, or at least two very large regions, that really represent where the population has concentrated. And then new areas have popped up, areas that were not there before. A good example being perhaps the area of Gastonia or Wilmington, Wilmington are examples. Elizabeth City, Elizabethtown are all areas in which sudden growth has occurred. So it is not surprising to us because we see this pattern in other places in the United States. But it's also a sign that the population is not one type of population, that there's a diversity of population, more urban, semi-rural, rural, that there's populations doing different kinds of work because these areas represent different types of jobs, and that there's also areas that were previously non-Latino that are becoming much so. So just to focus on one thing, or there's still, if you look at the map on the top, areas that are in the lightest color, which represent areas in which Latinos were almost not existent in 2000. And as you look at it now, there's that part of western North Carolina that still has, it has very little population to start with, but few Latinos. And then there's the part on the northeast, a couple of tips along the edges, and everything else has some color in it, representing that Latinos have distributed themselves throughout most of the state. When we look at Latinos in North Carolina, there's some things that are interesting to us. The amount of immigration going into North Carolina has slowed down. It's slowed down throughout the United States, but 38% of the Latinos in North Carolina, when they filled out their census, tell us that they previously lived abroad, meaning in another country, mostly Mexico, but other places as well. And so about 38% of the population comes from their native countries. 40% of it actually are Latinos who have migrated from other states to North Carolina. We think some of this is south-to-south migration, that is people, let's say in Alabama, who find that job prospects are better in North Carolina, or they could be coming from Florida, because we do find more and more Puerto Ricans in the area. So they could be coming from Florida, they could be coming from other states, but they are at least are part of a second step in the migration process, not the first step. And the fact that they now outnumber those who come directly from another country indicates that people come in, perhaps get a foothold in some part of the United States, and then come into North Carolina. The 22% that are born in North Carolina are, for the most part, children. I think if we looked at this number a little bit deeper, we'd find that about 98% of it are people under the age of 15. And these are individuals, a lot of them are infants, born in North Carolina over the last decade and a half, or last 2 decades, and are relatively young. Demographically in the United States, the population under 20 is about 92% U.S. born. And so the expectations there, I didn't look at this number deeper, but that's what my expectation. Mexico continues to be the country that still dominates. 68% of the people who live in North Carolina have Mexican origins. But the diversity of other groups coming in has really increased. This number was higher before, and I expect it to drop. Central Americans have become are now in sizable number, as are Cubans and Puerto Ricans, and all other Hispanic groups or Spanish origin groups are there as well. So the dynamics of the mix is increasing and changing over time. The next chart is just sort of a way of trying to remind people about what this is all about. And this is where I'll finish up because we'll have time for questions, and I think Deborah has some fascinating things to talk about in terms of education. North Carolina is what we call a new terrain. Non-whites are now 1/3 of the population, but that 1/3, of course, is no longer what it was before. So while North Carolina's population remains mostly white, 21% is African American, 8% are Hispanic, 2.3 Asian, 1.3 American Indian, and already North Carolina has begun to undergo a dynamic transformation of exactly what its demographics are about. The main thing that shows up when you look at Latinos in North Carolina is how few elderly are there and how many are youthful. It accounts for 50% of the growth in the public schools. There's a lot of schools in North Carolina that are private, and I couldn't find that information on private schools. But in the public schools, literally there would be somewhere close to approximately 30 elementary schools that would not be open today if it were not for the growth of Latino population in North Carolina. Latinos are highly employed, and they, according to the information I got from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, about one of every they take about 1 of every 3 new jobs that appear in North Carolina. But a lot of these are in construction, and we all know we just went through a recession, so there's no way to capture it quite yet because it's a little bit close to time. But we expect that a lot of people who used to work in construction have moved into service industries, which is what's happened in other parts of the United States. The presence in North Carolina has gone from minimal, about 1% 20 years ago, 5% 10 years ago, to 8% today. And clearly they're more visible as people and as a group and all the things that come with visibility. And then as I showed, the immigration is mostly from Mexico, South America, Cuba, and now it's also Puerto Ricans, which is migration, not immigration. The impact on North Carolina is everywhere. Actually, the schools is the most important. I repeated the data above because the schools, which are primarily teachers who are white and African Americans, have had to make a huge adjustment to teaching young Latino kids. And I'll leave it at that because there's more to be talked about in terms of schools. There's some information from the state that the consumer base right now accounts for about $18 billion worth of consumer, and therefore adds greatly to the economy, the growing economy of North Carolina. And it's not insignificant number, and it's something that's important. Entrepreneurship has begun, as it always does with immigrant groups. About 2.7% of all businesses in North Carolina are now minority-owned by Latinos, and most of these are women. But overall, it's the beginning of something we see everywhere, where small businesses take hold, attract customers, and then eventually more businesses appear. And it's not unusual, and I expect that number to double or triple very quickly in North Carolina. Voting power is relatively weak still. About 1.5% of all the registered voters are Latino. But it's actually more important perhaps that the vote is not overly dispersed, but it's concentrated in several areas. And so in the primaries that were held in North Carolina, efforts were made to reach out to this population because not quite knowing exactly how the state was going to go, that 1.5% can make a difference, in particular in some local elections for sure, and in the state elections perhaps less so. But that impact will continue to grow as kids, get older and become registered. The pertinent issues that arise are continue to be the same in North Carolina as we find them in South Carolina and Virginia and other places. Immigrant integration is what everybody is concerned about, that immigrants are not integrating as rapidly or as quickly as in the past. And that's probably somewhat true. But I will also say that integration has decelerated but still continues, and I think that's pretty evident when we look at overall at the trends. But it's happening in the context of anti-immigrant sentiment, which can be very strong, and there's been many laws that have been tried to pass throughout the South in particular, anti-immigration laws along the lines of Arizona. And you can't get away from this sentiment because it becomes an issue almost everywhere you go. The last time I was in North Carolina, I was at a town hall, and despite the fact that the topic had nothing to do with immigration, the question of immigration came up regardless. And I think you find that wherever you go. The language needs are an important element that continues to plague the situation in North Carolina. The foreign-born population is sizable. They use Spanish. The number of service providers, the number of individuals in schools and other places that can speak directly to parents or to individuals about their situations continues to be an issue. Language needs are extensive. This is also true of Asians, not just Latinos. But North Carolina, for the most part, was really unprepared for this diversity of languages that is now appeared. The last one is about low educational attainment. It's a persistent and consistent issue in North Carolina and one that requires attention. I'll let Deborah elaborate on this, but this is probably the key to the issue of immigrant integration. It's key to the voting. It's probably key to some of the issues related to businesses, and it's probably also to employment. So in some ways, it's a starting point for everything. And so what I'd like to do is just stop there and move it on to Deborah.
Thank you, Leo, so much for that overview of what's happening across the United States as well as in North Carolina. And so now we will turn it over to Deborah to walk us through specifically some of the educational issues in the state and what possible trends are that we can work on. Deborah, are you there?
Yes. Hi. Can you hear me okay, Althea?
Yes. Great. Thank you for
Wonderful.
being here.
Thank you all so much. I think always a challenge when you've got 10 minutes or so to talk about an issue that I think is very complex, and as we all know, education is really human enterprise. So I will share with you a little bit of data, I think hopefully complementing the good information that Leo shared, and see if I can focus a little bit more on some of the challenges, barriers, and some of what we know works, some common threads that can spur thinking questions as you all look to the work in North Carolina and what can be done, looking specifically at Latinos. So I just want to give you a little bit of context. I put it as context. Here's one of the first challenges that we often face in education, and that's really understanding the population. Leo shared some really good information with you. I wanted to share a couple more just, I think, to be prodding as we get to looking at what action we can take in addressing Latino students. So in addition to what we shared, we want to make sure that there's an accurate profile of the Latino population. And in North Carolina and in so many places across the country, there's this kind of a deficit model approach in thinking about Latinos in education, with this basic assumption that the overwhelming majority of us are English language learners, are high school dropouts, and undocumented students. And certainly it's true that some of us are, and we might be more likely to be that than others. But the majority of Latinos nationally, but also in North Carolina, don't reflect that profile completely. And I would posit to you that as we think about what works in education for Latinos, that we look to an asset-based model to build on the skills they have, but also be aware that this paradigm of us versus them, or Latinos or this other group, no longer holds in North Carolina and other places where many Latinos are, as we say here, they're citizens. Their parents might be immigrants, but often the youth are not. They are U.S. born. They're more likely to speak English at home, or about as likely, or be bilingual. And those are strengths to build on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't address English language needs and undocumented needs, but I think just the perception and figuring out this population in education is important. I also put in here about the percent of births, just because as you think about education, it is a continuum. When you see the population and that births are increasing, we know that's our future educational population. And so just trying to give, complementing the kind of information that Leo shared as you think about Latinos. And obviously education, is impacted by issues much broader than just enrollment. But I wanted to share just a quick snapshot, again, of what we know over the last 12 years in North Carolina. In 2000, 2001, Latinos represented about 4% of K-12 enrollment and about 2% of the charter school enrollment. I just included both of these. But when we looked at 2011-12, which is the most recent data that's available, obviously, it's almost 14% of Hispanic enrollment, and that's, almost an increase of, 3 times what it was a little over 10 years ago. So we are seeing a real growth in the population that's enrolled in K-12 education. And given what we know about birth rates and the projected increase in census, that's expected to continue an uphill climb in terms of representation. It's just something to be conscious of. And so I also share a little bit of a snapshot about 3 components when we think about Latinos in education that we just need to keep in our mind as we think about what works. One is academic preparation, and I just pulled a couple of very quick stats that I thought might be helpful. This came out in 2010, so it's 2009 data pretty much. And Latinos in 2009 were about 11%, so not the 14%. Already that alone tells you the kind of growth. When we look at proficiency in reading and math, Latinos compared to all, and this is just North Carolina, we see that we do confront academic preparation issues for our Latino students, starting as early as the 3rd and 4th grade that we're tracking in math and in reading that we should be paying attention to overall. And the second piece that I try to put together a couple of stats on is looking at issues of suspension and student attention overall. And we see actually Latinos are a little less likely to be suspended, either short or long term. And what that tells us about a level of engagement in the system is something that we just need to think about. And the third is taking a look at completion in K-12, looking at dropout rates versus completion and graduation. And again, when we look at this, the dropout rate for Latinos is a little bit higher than all, and our high school completion is a little bit lower in North Carolina. That's not to say the majority aren't completing, but as we look at the actual numbers of set cohorts, we could be doing better in addressing Latinos' high school graduation. And knowing this as compared to all is important as we look to where we could target limited resources and efforts and energy at the community-based level and at the public school level. A couple of very quick challenges and barriers, and I really wanted to approach this thinking that, as we know well, education doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are barriers around that influence and can strengthen or challenge academic preparation and continuation and completion of college. And I think these are challenges that exist a lot in K-12, which is what we see here, but they do permeate through college. And very basic things, they focus on 3 areas again, looking at health, safety, and family security. And I think it speaks to what we need to, again, potential interventions and investment strategies of what we're doing to serve this population in North Carolina. So when I say no medical home, it basically means there isn't insurance, that students aren't regularly getting access to the kind of health care that they need. And it's almost 30% compared to 16% for all. And the teen pregnancy rate that we see is higher for Latinos than others. And those are 2 key areas that are important as part of health that we just need to pay attention to, and the implications about their ability to do well in their education structure and system. Safety, I try to put a couple of elements here as we think about safety. It's come up a lot in media and attention. We do see that slightly more report of gang problems at school, and slightly more likely to be bullied on school property, more likely to have been offered or sold drugs at school. And I think those are important as we think about the environment in which our youth are trying to get their education, and what that means in terms of the schools and where they're enrolled and the resources available to the schools in serving their students well. And that's why I tried to bring in a couple of those examples. These are elements that can distract from the academic preparation and quality of education of our youth. And the last I wanted to take a look at, again, these numbers are relatively small, but what I find interesting is being home alone after school. There was a comment about, Latino students are a little less likely to be latchkey kids, that their parents are involved and engaged. And I thought, in part that's a safety issue, but it does deal with family components, and that's going to be critical when we get to what common threads we know work. So the last section is really family economic security, and we all know the link between socioeconomic status and educational achievement. So I just tried to bring a couple that seem very basic, but alludes to the points, as simple as having meals with their parents every night. And Latinos are much more likely to have dinner with their families every night. The opportunity to talk about educational opportunities and what's going on around the dinner table is very critical. And this is an environment that I think we don't talk enough about in being able to inject good information and support to families. So in this space, when they're talking to each other, education is a part of that discussion and options of what they can do. And then I just put two economic factors here. Latinos are much more likely in North Carolina to live in poverty or extreme poverty, and kind of the other way of looking at it is defined in low income. And what was interesting when you look deeper into this data is that the vast majority of Latinos who are low income or in poverty, their parents are working, and that relates to something that Leo was saying earlier. So this is a kind of working poor, looking at the kind of jobs and earnings they get. And that's, again, that's all context about challenges and barriers in serving students, but I think it's important to think about all the components in education. Two more quick points, data, then I wanted to focus a little more on what works. Just a very quick snapshot at higher education. And we pulled some data that we released recently looking at degree attainment in all of the 50 states. This is specific to North Carolina, and we saw that of all adults 25 to 64, 38% of adults in North Carolina have an associate degree or higher. And for Hispanics in North Carolina, that number is 17%. And I hope, the reason for sharing all this data is if you think about the composite, if 17% of Latino parents have an associate degree or higher, and we have such a growth of the K-12 population that are Latino, it's not hard to make the link that many of these Latino youth are potentially first-generation college goers, and efforts and practices that can inform potential first-generation college goers are important. We can't presume that there's a knowledge base there if you've got, when you combine educational attainment of the parent with the opportunities of the youth. Another just very quick point, and I acknowledge this is a little bit nerdy policy data, but I just want to give another quick snapshot in sometimes how we talk about higher education. And I looked at North Carolina. This is a set year. We're updating this data. But I thought the gaps haven't changed that much. We looked at the equity gap in measuring completion, college completion in North Carolina, and we looked at whites, non-Hispanics, and Hispanics, just to have a baseline. We have actually data on all the ethnic groups, but where we saw the biggest equity gap in completion was between these two groups, and certainly in North Carolina, and it mirrors kind of what we know nationally. I won't go into tons of detail other than saying no one measure for college completion is perfect, and so we try to identify 3 different metrics that look at cohort and then the broader community. The first two, graduation rates and completions per full-time equivalent, are looking at a cohort of students that are enrolled in higher education. And then the third one is looking at the population and need. So whether or not they've ever been enrolled in college, what do we see in terms of the population? So three different numbers that I think the core takeaway is that we do see gaps in attainment consistent with what we had seen in the previous slide. But looking at rates from a policy perspective means we need to think about what we're doing. The last slide I wanted to share with you, and I know there's a lot of words here, but I want to point out the component of what works. And these are two examples in higher education, but more importantly, it's the common threads of what we know works. And I hope that few of this are necessarily a surprise, but I'm using these two as concrete examples of common threads that permeate in K-12 and in higher education, and how two very concrete examples in North Carolina are trying to address these common threads. So the first is a Community Spanish Facilitator Certificate at Durham Technical Community College. The gist of it is they are creating a certificate for paraprofessionals to help with translation and interpretation and seeing the growth. Very targeted. Here are some of the common threads, though, about what works that I think permeates in K-12 and higher ed. First, this is a very inclusive program. I mean, it's overt in that it's targeting Spanish speakers or the potential to serve Spanish speakers, even if you're not a Spanish speaker. And that inclusivity and that intentionality in outreaching to a community for service and providing a certificate to do so really is a recognition of the growth of the community and the interest of an institution to serve that community. And I think those are critical when we think about common threads of what works for Latinos. We often hear this comment, you know, that, no, we're educating all, and so we don't distinguish. But I would posit that given some of the data we see, if we still see gaps in educational attainment and achievement and academic preparation, we need to do a better job at educating all, and that sometimes disaggregating makes sense. The other component of this piece, this example, builds on current knowledge, which I think is important. That's something that we know works for Latinos in education, is building on current knowledge. And it could mean that in K-12, a student that is limited English proficient is also in a dual language program. So you build on their current knowledge of Spanish while you're strengthening their English. There are positive examples we see building on current knowledge that we need to focus on. The other is a link to skills and workforce needs. It's concrete. Often, even if the students are U.S. born and the parents are immigrants, there's a real income need, and being able to link the services and education with skills and workforce are very important to first-generation college-goers and to those serving. And that's a K-12 issue as well as higher ed. And I don't just mean technical knowledge, but we've seen integration in the content of the readings so that they're relevant to youth and students that we need to think about, so that there's a link to the student, they can identify themselves in what they're learning. And the other common thread in this first example is that they are tracking progress and success. You see there is over, that they increased GPAs and completion and retention and success, and they actually followed to employment. So tracking progress by disaggregating data is an important common thread in what we know works for Latinos throughout the educational pipeline. The second new and enhanced Latino programming, this is North Carolina State University. Again, very intentional, very comfortable saying Latino programming. And none of this is done to the exclusion of others. None of these programs only serve Hispanics, but they're very overt in who they serve and that Latinos are included. And that's a powerful message for what works, regardless of the point in the educational pipeline you're working. So if you don't mind, I'll give you 4 more kind of common threads of what works, and this is an example, and then hopefully open it up to questions from you all. So basically, this is a cradle-to-college model, and they create a full-time position to help support this model and what they were doing. And so here's some interesting components. I don't want to read this directly to you, but there's really alignment here. When you've got cradle to college, you've got alignment in the K-12 system with higher education, and there's a level of ownership of that youth. Rather than leaving all the responsibility on the student, you create a system that is supportive throughout their educational process. It sounds trite. It's all the things we think we know. It's always surprising to me how few programs we find are actually aligned to support students from through K-12 and higher. So I think this is an interesting point for us overall, and it's consistent because what you also have here in creating a position, you've got culturally sensitive staff that support students, and that's something that we know can work very well. That doesn't mean they're necessarily Latino, but that they're culturally sensitive to the needs of students. And hiring somebody that's, Hispanic student affairs, the presumption is that one of the criteria is that they are culturally sensitive and can work with the student population. Then some of the examples of what they're doing, there's a parental engagement component here in education and decisions, and kind of a family support system. And we've seen with Latino students that engaging the family, whether it's the older sibling or the parent in the educational process, is powerful. And that doesn't mean just having them attend a PTA session. It really is including them in part of the educational experience, using them to help support and reinforce the educational components going on. And sometimes if their parents are immigrants, they don't even know the educational system. So we don't want to presume that there is the support and knowledge, and providing it can only help. Some of the two other pieces we see, meeting students where they're at. It's an important part of what this program is, but also in trying to figure out what works for these students. Having high expectations and a solid pedagogy. None of the work for high expectations should be to denigrate the rigor and the pedagogy that's provided, whether it's K-12 or higher education, but that we need to make sure that aligned with that pedagogy and high expectations are this kind of support and knowledge base to make sure that this effort can work well for Latino students. And just a broader comment is, I think, when you read this, there's a component here about community engagement and kind of creating a trust or support environment in the Latino community that I think can multiply for whether it's institutions of higher education or the public school system or community-based organizations, so that a trust factor with the Latino community can go far in having them access the services provided, but also inform those practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I appreciate all the information, and definitely we have some questions that will pop up. For all of our attendees, if you would like to, in the chat box, you can send your questions to the host, and we will read them and have Deborah and Leo respond to them. To kick off a couple of questions I have, Leo, you talked about the economic impact of immigrant communities as they move into an area and how that grows as a natural occurrence in all other sorts of states. Can you talk a little bit about what we might be looking at as far as workforce development moving forward with our Latino population, and then potentially that intersection that Deborah was just referring to about tying education to workforce development as well? Oh, and I'm sorry, I guess I need to unmute Leo in order for him to respond. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I'll be real brief. I was in North Carolina about 5 months ago, and the meeting that I went to was about caregiving. And it was about the elderly African-American population that needs care and who is going to provide it. And, of course, you already know the answer as to who is going to provide that care. And the question became, how do we make sure that these Latina women get the proper training that they need for caretaking? But as I was going through that meeting, people began to talk to me about some other areas in which Latinos have begun to sort of carve a new niche. And some of the men there who had originally came to do landscaping for golf courses. and have moved on now to other things. But their wives, during the time that they were out in these mostly rural areas of North Carolina, didn't have jobs, and so caretaking has become one of the areas in which they moved in very quickly. And they need to go to community college in order to get a certificate to serve with certain agencies. They need certain training in health and other things, and so that was what this was about. But it was seen as a critical moment in which if these Latina women, mostly women, did not obtain the appropriate training, that there would be a crisis in North Carolina. And so that's just one example of the many, many things that are going on beyond golf courses and caretaking. We also see, the increased number of individuals moving into professional services. So somebody has to do the taxes for the Latino community, and somebody has to be accountants for the businesses and others. And suddenly there's a new proliferation of small professional services that are emerging, which I expect to be one of the high-growth areas in North Carolina.
Great, thank you so much. Deborah, I wanted to ask you about the asset-based focus that you discussed from the very beginning, and how can you really build on that here in North Carolina as far as how we look at Latinos in K-12, which right now I think is mostly deficit-based, and how we encourage our higher ed institutions to see them as an asset to North Carolina.
Thank you, Althea. I think, this is a continual challenge that we fight, almost the perception of a community and what we can do to build on the knowledge base and what's already there. And so I think this is much a struggle in creating an accurate profile in the broader media and awareness and attention within the school and the school district infrastructure as it is anywhere else. And because that, as I go across the country, that negative stereotype continues to persist. I am a believer, and I acknowledge that, being a data nerd, I think, having continually positing an accurate profile of the population specifically being served, like in North Carolina, that has to help. And making sure that we identify the strengths and not just the challenges and barriers to serving this population is, I think the onus is on us to make sure we show that. And so I think those are two areas that create space. I'm continually have to remind myself that there's a profound ignorance about this population that we need to make sure to address in order to serve them well. An inaccurate profile creates inaccurate and bad policy and programs. So I think continually sharing good information, campaigning, having conversations with others about an accurate profile of this population, and then making sure there's a balance in presentation so that it's not just about the challenges and barriers, but also the assets, the strengths, which I think we tried to, and then a clarity about what we can do, kind of the examples of what works. I think we have to have all of those quivers in our, at the ready to address serving the population.
Great. And could both of you talk about some integration strategies? Leo referred to that in his presentation about how do we integrate the immigrant community, especially considering some of the anti-immigrant sentiment, some strategies that might be helpful here in North Carolina.
Deborah, go first, because education is the key.
I agree, and what we also know about education, especially in the United States, is that it is our main tool to make sure there's integration. It provides kind of the social norms that we have in our communities. So I think making sure that there is an inclusive and supportive environment of high expectations in educational institutions across North Carolina are absolutely critical. Some concrete things that we can do to make sure there's integration. I'll give three. I think, one we had mentioned before about what works is to make sure that there's family engagement and there's a sense that families feel they belong, because integration is not in isolation. It's not individualistic for this community. For Latinos, it's often their support structure that facilitates or limits integration. And so I guess that would probably be the first one. The second, I guess I would say, is if we can really approach this community from an asset-based and build and provide things like dual language schools, which we have, I live in Virginia and we've got them here that show a balance, creates an integration that is still authentic to their own personal backgrounds, but is also integrated into the community that is North Carolina, because it's not just a one-sided integration. It comes both ways. I guess I'll stop there because I don't want to go too long, but those are two, I think, that are absolutely key to make sure, and given the institution of education.
I just want to add that we should have no doubt that immigrants want to integrate. Throughout the United States, when immigrants are asked what they want, the first thing they always ask for is a job, because they know that they need economic stability, first of all. The second thing they want is a better education for their kids than they had. And then the third thing they want to do is learn English. And every one of those things, if you think about it, is an integrative process. And so I don't think there's any doubt that integration is desired, but it's tougher to do so sometimes than in other places. Latinos who find themselves in rural areas of North Carolina just have a tougher time than those in areas where they have a larger community. And so the desire is there, but the means are not always as simple to get.
That's a really great reminder, Leo, because I think it's true of all immigrant communities, as you just said, whether they're Latino or Asian, Russian, they really want to have a job, have their kids be educated, and then integrate into the system.
Well, I should say also, if you're coming from California into North Carolina, there's a whole integration process there, too.
True.
Yes.
We have a question from one of our attendees. Are there noteworthy examples in North Carolina's K-12 schools of what is effective for academic preparation, or is there something we can learn from other states?
Leo, if you don't mind, I'll start maybe, and then you can jump in.
All right.
So I think there are a plethora of examples across the country. I have to apologize. I've known some of these common threads we focus on because it's hard to find one thing that works and is replicable and scalable given context. So I didn't bring one that I have here, but we do have examples of what's working across the country. And I always pull to the common threads because I don't want to presume that it's can be effective. What works in Texas is going to work in North Carolina. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I'm happy to follow up with Althea. I know we've been working with the College Board to identify K-12 efforts, and we've got them. I don't know if North Carolina is specific, but we do have them from across the country. I'm happy to put her in contact with that person so you can get access to those concrete examples.
Great.
Let me just add one thing. I would say you have to take one step back. As I've looked, I've seen studies more. I haven't conducted them myself, but I've seen the studies, and they seem to indicate that the K-12 experience actually starts a couple of years before the K, and that is the pre-K, and that Latinos have a tendency not to put their kids in preschool, partly because preschool is not necessarily free. You have to pay for it. Until you get to the pre-K, which is available in some public school systems. And then secondly, that it's also kind of almost cultural, the idea of holding on to your children as long as you can rather than letting them go. But the attendance of Latino kids in preschool throughout the United States, and I'm sure this is true of North Carolina, is about 10 to 12% less than it is for other groups. African Americans have figured out that this is really critical, and their rates are very, very high. Whites go up and down depending on what part of the country you're in, but Latinos are consistently low. It's those first few years where people begin to learn English, learn basic ideas that go with schooling that often our kids are missing. So I would put one of the emphasis upon trying to succeed in K through 12 as what happens just before that period.
That's a great point. We have a council of folks here in North Carolina looking at educational issues, and definitely the pre-K part came up as a key factor of getting kids prepared so that they don't start late already on the first day of school. I want to have you both comment on one thing. In the LA airport, I was in LA recently, there was this huge poster that said, "American dreams come true with a college degree," and it was a Latino immigrant family with their, newly Americanized Latino student. And and that was in LA, obviously not in North Carolina yet. Wanted to ask you about sort of the movement of Latino acceptance into the educational world and how you see that moving across the country from obvious acceptance in California or New York to the new states in the South.
I'll just start with a couple of observations. The talk that I gave, had to do with serving rural areas of North Carolina, and I think if there's two things that I found fascinating was the initial clash, and I will call it a clash, and tension that occurred when the Latino kids started coming into the school system, and the interesting way in which the adaptation has been occurring. Now, I can't say specifically for any schools what's happened, but what was expressed to me was that it was pretty much a shock when suddenly September came around and all of a sudden they looked in the classroom and there were all these brown faces and nobody was prepared and no one knew what to do and the teachers weren't prepared for it, and that there was a moment of crisis and panic about it all. North Carolina has actually done a fairly good job, and I've been looking at it, and because I look at ethnic-racial relations in terms of what it means in the future. And North Carolina is a place where African-American children and Latino children study together. I should point out that it's not unusual in large urban cities for that to happen, but for the most part in the United States, Latino kids are either with white kids or Asian kids, and African-American kids are by themselves or with white kids. So this is a lab that's going to be fascinating to watch because it should change Black-Latino relations in North Carolina in a very different way, and they'll emerge differently than they have in California. California has the number of blacks are too small for this kind of a dynamic to happen, and so that's fascinating. The second thing is that almost every single, I would be going to go out on a limb and say 95% of all Latino college kids are first-generation college goers. They've never gone through this process, and it means that the universities in themselves have been having to adapt to what do you do with kids whose parents, who are having to learn the system along with everything else. And I like the example given by Deborah about North Carolina State, but I can assure you that this is not easy working with a generation of, the first generation of college-going kids, not just in one place, but every institution, community college, colleges and universities, and this creates incredible challenges. North Carolina is having difficulties, from what I understand, in making those adaptations, but at least they're trying to make them. And so I like what Deborah, she was very optimistic about it. I think I'm also optimistic, but I don't think we can ignore the fact that it's going to have some rocky steps along the way.
Yeah. I would agree. I get just one last thing, because I know our time is almost up, is I would say, the kind of work that you all are trying to do, HIP, in North Carolina, those are the kinds of things we're seeing across the country. And that kind of place-based community approach is going to have to be what creates a tipping point and awareness and the opportunity to serve this population. And I think we have to believe that's what's possible. So I do think it is creating awareness, making sure there's analysis of what really works, and then people taking concerted action that's going to make the difference.
Great. Well, thank you both, and thanks to all who attended. We will be sending out a link with the recording for this, as well as a one-page fact sheet that Deborah has on education in North Carolina. That'll be coming to you by email tomorrow. So thank you all, and particularly thank you to Leo and to Deborah for their time and their expertise in helping us understand more clearly what the work ahead is in North Carolina. A good afternoon and good morning to Leo, and good afternoon to everybody else.